Walker County Jane Doe. On the morning of November 1st, 1980, a truck driver discovered a body off Interstate 45 near Huntsville, Texas. The scene told a story of something terrible that had unfolded just hours earlier. A young woman lay in the grass, her life taken through strangulation with pantyhose. Red high-heeled sandals rested nearby, and she wore a gold necklace with a blue pendant, small details that would haunt investigators for over 4 decades. Witnesses at a nearby hitch-and-post truck stop recalled seeing her on Halloween night, dressed in jeans, a yellow pullover, and white sweater, asking for directions to Ellis Prison Farm. Perhaps she was trying to visit someone. Perhaps she was simply lost. The autopsy confirmed what the scene suggested: asphyxiation by strangulation with no substances in her system. She'd been alert and aware when someone made the choice to end her life. For 41 years, she was known only as Walker County Jane Doe, buried unnamed in Oakwood Cemetery, while her family searched for answers they didn't even know existed. Theories circulated that she might be a runaway from Rockport or Aransas Pass, Texas, based on her comments to a waitress. But despite forensic reconstructions and an exhumation in 1999 for DNA testing, no identification emerged. The case seemed destined to remain a mystery, another nameless victim whose story would never be fully told. The breakthrough that would finally give her back her name came in 2020, when Walker County Sheriff's Detective Thomas Bean partnered with Othram, a forensic DNA lab. They faced a significant challenge. The brain tissue preserved from the autopsy had been damaged by preservatives, making traditional DNA analysis impossible. But specialized genome sequencing techniques allowed them to build a profile anyway, then trace genealogical matches through public databases. By March 2021, they had identified potential relatives. Family DNA testing confirmed what seemed impossible after so many years. She was Sherri Jarvis from Stillwater, Minnesota. Sherri had been removed from her home for truancy and ran away after her birthday in March 1980. Her last contact with family was a letter from Denver, expressing frustration with custody, but promising to reconnect between ages 18 and 21. She never got that chance. Her family, who had hired private investigators and kept their phone number unchanged for decades in hope, finally had an answer to where she had gone. But the person responsible for taking her life remained unknown. The motive appeared opportunistic, targeting someone vulnerable and alone on a highway far from home. At the 2021 press conference announcing the identification, Sheriff Clint McRae stated, "We loved her as well," emphasizing that Walker County had never forgotten the young woman they had buried. Her family mourned the lost years and experiences. She was deprived of so many life experiences. She loved children, animals, and horseback riding. Detective Bean continues investigating potential links to other regional cold cases, wondering if the same person might be responsible for similar incidents. Othram founder David Middleman noted the case's significance. As long as there's DNA, there's hope. In 2022, a new headstone was placed on Sherri's grave on what would have been her birthday, replacing the marker that had read only Jane Doe. Now her name stands as testimony that even decades later, identity can be restored. But the case remains open, with someone still unidentified who took a young runaway's life on a Texas highway in 1980. What drives someone to take such actions remains as mysterious as Sherri's identity once was. Jane Doe number 7. The discovery of partial remains on Fire Island, New York in April 1996 seemed like an isolated tragedy. Legs and feet had washed ashore, belonging to someone whose identity would remain unknown for over 2 decades. But the case would eventually connect to something far larger and more disturbing. In 2011, during searches related to the infamous Gilgo Beach serial investigations, additional remains, a skull and other bones, were discovered 15 miles from the original site. DNA testing linked the 2 discoveries, confirming they belonged to the same person. She became known as Jane Doe No. 7, one of 11 sets of remains found in the area between 2010 and 2011, most belonging to those who worked in certain professions that left them vulnerable. Karen Vergata had vanished on Valentine's Day 1996 from Manhattan, where she worked. No missing person report was ever filed, possibly because of her transient lifestyle and limited family connections. For years, no one officially looked for her, and her remains lay unidentified while investigators worked other aspects of the broader Gilgo Beach cases. The identification finally came in October 2022 through genetic genealogy conducted by the FBI, confirmed with a relative's DNA. However, authorities withheld the announcement until August 2023, as the information was relevant to ongoing grand jury proceedings in the larger serial investigation. The circumstances of her passing remain unclear, though the dismemberment of her remains strongly suggests intentional harm rather than accident or natural causes. The scattered nature of the remains, spread across multiple sites 15 miles apart, indicates careful disposal meant to prevent identification. In 2023, Rex Hoyerman, an architect, was charged with 3 Gilgo Beach cases and suspected in a 4th. Investigators have not yet tied him to Karen's case, though the possibility remains under investigation. Suffolk County District Attorney Ray Tierney emphasized at the announcement, "It is important to note that there are no charges at this time, focusing instead on restoring dignity to Karen through identification." The lack of a missing person report highlights how some individuals can disappear without anyone raising alarms. Karen's profession and lifestyle meant that periods without contact weren't necessarily unusual to those who knew her, allowing years to pass before anyone might have thought to look for her. Prosecutors continue seeking DNA comparisons with Hoyerman's profile as they investigate potential connections to multiple cases. 3 additional sets of remains from the Gilgo Beach discoveries, belonging to a man, woman, and toddler, are nearing identification through similar genetic genealogy techniques. The case remains open, with the person or persons responsible for Karen's passing still not definitively identified. After 27 years of being nameless, Karen Vergata has her identity back. But justice remains elusive. The answers about what happened during those final hours in 1996 may still emerge as the broader Gilgo Beach investigation continues. Sometimes identifications come not from solving a new case, but from revisiting old confessions. Horseshoe Harriet. When remains were discovered near Horseshoe Lake outside Anchorage, Alaska, in April 1984, investigators knew immediately they were dealing with something disturbing. The location, the condition of the remains, and the circumstances all pointed to a pattern that was becoming horrifyingly familiar in Alaska. Robert Hansen, known as the Butcher Baker, had been targeting vulnerable individuals around Anchorage for years. His method was particularly calculated. He would abduct people, fly them to remote wilderness locations, release them, and then hunt them like game. By the time authorities apprehended him, he had confessed to 17 cases and led police via helicopter to various grave sites scattered across Alaska's vast wilderness. Among those sites was Horseshoe Lake, where the remains that would be dubbed Horseshoe Harriet had been found. Hansen confessed to this case as part of his 1984 plea deal, stating that the person had been taken in July 1983. He pleaded guilty to 4 cases in 1984 and was sentenced to prison, where he would die in 2014, taking with him detailed knowledge about victims whose names remained unknown. For 37 years, Horseshoe Harriet remained unidentified despite Hansen's confession. The woman had no missing person report on file, no one officially searching for her, making identification through traditional means nearly impossible. Her remains held DNA, but without something to compare it to, that evidence remained unhelpful. The breakthrough came in 2021, years after Hansen's passing. Her remains had been exhumed in 2014 for DNA extraction and uploaded to genealogy databases. Genetic genealogy built a family tree through distant relatives, eventually leading to Arkansas relatives whose DNA could be compared for kinship analysis. The results identified her as Robin Pelkey from Colorado, who had been living in Anchorage. She had moved to Arkansas as a teenager, then returned to Alaska to live with her father and stepmother in 1981. By 1982 to 1983, she had ended up on the streets, making her vulnerable to someone like Hansen, who specifically targeted those in difficult circumstances. Alaska State Troopers Randy McFerrinon noted the technique's potential for identifying other Hansen victims, including one still known only as Eklutna Annie. The same genetic genealogy approach that identified Robin could potentially give names to others who remain in unmarked graves or unidentified in evidence lockers. The identification announcement came on October 22, 2021. Alaska State Troopers arranged for a new grave marker, replacing the one that had marked her as unknown for nearly 4 decades. Robin's family requested privacy after learning the news, processing decades of not knowing what had happened to her. Hansen's motive was clear from his confessions and the pattern of his actions. He derived satisfaction from the hunt itself, viewing vulnerable individuals as prey in a twisted game across Alaska's wilderness. The forensic evidence confirmed what Hansen had told investigators. Robin had been shot and stabbed, consistent with his hunting methodology. The case is now closed with Robin's identification and Hansen's previous conviction. But it highlights how genetic genealogy can reach back through decades to restore names to those who were deliberately hidden. Robin Pelkey's story reminds us that even when the person responsible has been caught, tried, and passed away, there can still be unfinished business in giving victims back their identities. Yet some cases involve someone who remained hidden in plain sight for half a century. Julianne Hansen. July 8, 1972, started as an ordinary summer day in Naperville, Illinois. A young person borrowed their brother's bicycle to ride to his baseball game. A simple errand that countless others made without incident. Julianne Hansen never made it to that game. Her body was discovered the same day in a cornfield, and the scene told a story of something terrible. She had been stabbed 36 times, an intensity of action that suggested something deeply personal or profoundly disturbed. The case shocked the suburban community and launched an investigation that would span 5 decades. Investigators at the time pursued various leads, including looking at Major Morris, the convicted offender in other cases, but he was eventually ruled out. The case went cold as years passed without new developments, becoming one of those tragedies that communities remember but cannot solve. The evidence sat in storage, waiting for technology that didn't yet exist. The breakthrough came in 2021, when DNA from the scene was finally matched through genetic genealogy. The profile led investigators to Barry Lee Welpley, then 76 years old, a retired welder living in Minnesota. The revelation was shocking. Whelpley had been a neighbor living just a mile from the Hansen family in 1972. He had been there the entire time, living an apparently ordinary life while the family searched for answers. The implications were disturbing. How many times had paths crossed over the years? How many neighborhood gatherings or community events might have put him in proximity to the family still grieving? Whelpley was arrested in Minnesota and extradited to Illinois. During questioning, investigators conducted a 7-8-hour interview at his home that was recorded, though portions would later be excluded from evidence due to violations of eavesdropping laws. He pleaded not guilty, maintaining his innocence despite the DNA evidence. The motive remains unknown. The investigation found no previous connection between Whelpley and the family. No obvious reason why he would have targeted Julianne that day. The randomness of it makes it somehow more disturbing. An ordinary bike ride, intersecting with someone harboring dark intentions. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors argued that Whelpley posed a danger to the community and should remain detained. His defense team countered with arguments about his health issues, painting a picture of an elderly man in declining condition. The legal proceedings stretched on, delayed by various motions and procedural matters. Then, in February 2024, before trial could begin, Whelpley passed away in jail from a heart attack. The case was sealed, denying the Hansen family the day in court they had waited 52 years to see. No conviction, no confession, no explanation for why their loved one never came home from that bike ride in 1972. The family has since sought to have the case records unsealed, wanting the public to know what evidence was gathered and what the investigation revealed, even without a trial. The death before trial raises difficult questions about justice delayed becoming justice denied. The DNA finally proved what happened, but not why. And the person responsible never faced a jury. Naperville Police Chief Robert Marshall's words at the time of arrest captured what many felt. This is for Julie. But without a trial or conviction, the closure remains incomplete. Another example of how even solved cases can leave families with lingering questions. But some individuals didn't hide quietly. They taunted authorities for years. April Tinsley. The abduction in Fort Wayne, Indiana, on April 1, 1988, seemed at first like a terrible but not uncommon tragedy. A young person vanished while on a simple errand, taken in broad daylight from a neighborhood. April Tinsley's body was found 3 days later, leaving a community devastated and investigators with few leads beyond DNA evidence from the scene. Then the messages started. 2 years after the incident, someone painted a message on a barn. I kill 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley. Sick. Haha, I will kill again. The misspelling of April's last name and the mocking tone suggested someone who wanted attention, who derived satisfaction not just from the act itself, but from the fear and frustration it caused. For 14 years, silence. Then in 2004, notes began appearing on bicycles and in mailboxes around Fort Wayne. The messages were specific and threatening. Hi, honey. I am the same person that kidnapped and raped and killed April Tinsley. You are my next victim. Attached to these notes were used items containing DNA that matched the evidence from 1988. The psychological torment was calculated. The person responsible wasn't content with having committed harm. They wanted the community to know that they were still out there, still watching, still capable. The DNA evidence proved the same person was behind both the original incident and the taunting messages. But for years, investigators couldn't identify who that person was. The investigation became one of Fort Wayne's most intensive cold cases. More than 250 officers participated in searches. The case was featured on America's Most Wanted and Crime Watch daily, keeping April's story in the public consciousness. In 2015, Parabon Nanolabs created a phenotype sketch based on the DNA, showing what the person might look like, but still no identification came. The breakthrough arrived in 2018, when genetic genealogy through GED match narrowed the possibilities to a set of brothers. Investigators collected trash DNA from both, and one matched John D. Miller, then 59, living in a secluded trailer in Grabille. Neighbors described Miller as angry and reclusive. When arrested on July 15, 2018, Miller confessed to taking April, stating he had been trolling for victims, but selected her randomly. His confession revealed a chilling portrait of someone who had been looking for an opportunity and took it when April appeared. The confession included admission about the taunting messages. Miller acknowledged leaving the barn message and the later notes with their accompanying physical evidence. He denied any other incidents, but admitted to the predatory behavior that led to encountering April that day in 1988. Miller pleaded guilty on December 7, 2018, and was sentenced to 80 years on December 21st. At sentencing, April's mother Janet addressed him directly, expressing the pain of decades lived without her daughter. The community finally had a name and face to associate with 30 years of fear and grief. Then, on September 4, 2025, Miller passed away from natural causes at 66, 7 years into his sentence. April's family held a balloon release to mark the end of Miller's life, a symbolic letting go of someone who had haunted their family and community for 37 years. The psychological profile that emerged painted Miller as a predator with persistent urges who gained satisfaction from both the original acts and the terror caused by the taunting messages. Whether he had actually been searching for additional victims during those years or simply wanted to keep fear alive remains unknown. He denied other incidents, and no other cases have been definitively linked to him. April's case highlights how someone can hide in plain sight while continuing to torment a community through messages. The DNA evidence existed from 1988, but without genetic genealogy databases, it took 3 decades to connect that evidence to a name. The taunting messages, meant to demonstrate power and control, ultimately provided additional DNA samples that confirmed the connection once technology caught up. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. Sometimes the wrong person pays the price, for decades before truth emerges. Christine Jessop. October 3, 1984, started as an ordinary school day in Queensville, Ontario. Christine Jessop arrived home on the school bus that afternoon, a routine she had followed countless times before. But when her family returned home later, Christine was gone. The search began immediately, but it would be nearly 3 months before her body was discovered in Durham region on December 31st. The investigation quickly focused on a neighbor, Guy Paul Morin, a quiet man who played clarinet and kept bees. He lived near the Jessop family and seemed, to investigators, unusual. That perceived oddness, combined with pressure to solve a case that had devastated the community, led to his arrest in 1985. He was acquitted in 1986, but prosecutors retried him. And in 1992, he was convicted. For 18 months, an innocent man sat in prison for something he didn't do. The conviction relied heavily on hair, and fiber evidence that would later be revealed as contaminated. And on what the subsequent Kaufman report would describe as tunnel vision, investigators so convinced of Morin's involvement that they ignored evidence pointing elsewhere. In 1995, DNA testing finally exonerated Morin, proving definitively that he had no connection to what happened to Christine. The genetic evidence from the scene didn't match him. Someone else had been responsible all along, while Morin's life had been destroyed by wrongful conviction. The case became a landmark example of how investigations can go catastrophically wrong. But identifying who Morin wasn't didn't immediately reveal who was responsible. The DNA profile sat in databases for years, connected to no known person. Christine's case remained technically unsolved even after Morin's exoneration, with a genetic profile but no name attached to it. The answer came 25 years after Morin's exoneration in 2020, when genetic genealogy matched the DNA to Calvin Hoover, someone who had never been on investigators' radar. Hoover had been a friend of the Jessop family through work connections, someone who knew Christine and had access that wouldn't have seemed suspicious. The revelation was stunning. Hoover had attended Christine's funeral, grieved with the family, and watched as suspicion fell on Morin, all while knowing the truth. His ex-wife, Heather, when contacted by investigators, expressed shock. She described how Hoover had become increasingly moody in the 1990s and developed issues with substances, receiving a bipolar diagnosis in 2010. Heather criticized police for never questioning Hoover during the original investigation, noting that as a family friend, he should have been among those interviewed. The tunnel vision that focused on Morin had left actual investigative avenues unexplored. The motive remains unclear. Hoover had no known history of similar incidents, no obvious pattern that would have predicted what happened. He was familiar with the area where Christine's body was found through visits to friends, suggesting he knew where to go afterward. But what drove him to harm someone his family knew, someone he would then mourn publicly, remains unexplained. There would be no trial, no opportunity to hear Hoover's account or have questions answered in court. He had taken his own life in 2015, 5 years before genetic genealogy would reveal his identity. The case could be officially closed, but without the possibility of prosecution or even direct confrontation with the evidence. When the identification was announced in 2020, Guy Paul Morin stated he was relieved for Christine's family, finally having a definitive answer about who was responsible. But the relief was complicated by the reality that Hoover would never face justice, never be forced to explain or account for his actions. The case exposed multiple failures in the justice system. The Kaufman report's findings about tunnel vision, contaminated evidence, and rush to conviction led to reforms in how investigations are conducted. But those reforms came too late for Morin, whose years in prison for someone else's actions can never be returned. Christine's family endured not just the loss of their daughter, but years of watching an innocent man be prosecuted, while the actual person responsible remained free. The psychological complexity of Hoover attending the funeral, maintaining the friendship, and watching the wrong person be convicted suggests either profound compartmentalization or a level of manipulation that's difficult to comprehend. One detail that emerged was particularly haunting. At Christine's funeral, Hoover had screamed in what appeared to be grief. Christine's mother initially interpreted these screams as proof of Morin's guilt, not realizing they came from the actual person responsible performing grief for an audience. The case remains a watershed moment in Canadian justice, demonstrating how conviction of an innocent person doesn't bring closure. It compounds tragedy, Christine's family endured decades without truth. Moran lost years of his life to wrongful imprisonment. And Hoover evaded accountability until his passing. DNA eventually revealed the truth. But by then, one of the people who most needed to face that truth was gone. But wrongful focus on one person was only one way investigations could fail. Carla Walker. The parking lot of a bowling alley in Fort Worth, Texas, should have been a safe place on the night of February 17, 1974. Carla Walker and her boyfriend Rodney McCoy were sitting in his car when someone approached, struck Rodney with a weapon, and took Carla. Rodney, injured and disoriented, could provide only limited information to investigators who arrived to find him alone. 3 days later, Carla's body was found in a culvert. The scene confirmed what investigators feared. She'd been taken for a specific purpose before being left in a location meant for concealment. The case devastated the community and launched an intensive investigation that would ultimately go nowhere for 46 years. Despite a task force dedicated to finding who was responsible, the case went cold. The physical evidence existed. DNA had been preserved from the scene. But without modern technology and databases, that evidence couldn't point to anyone specific. Carla's case joined the ranks of unsolved incidents that families never forget and investigators never quite give up on. In 2018, the case was reopened. And Oxygen Media funded advanced DNA testing through Othrum's genome sequencing technology. The breakthrough came in 2020, when the genetic profile was built and matched to a family tree that led to Glenn Samuel McCurley, then 77 years old, still living in the Fort Worth area. Investigators discovered that McCurley had been interviewed in 1974 about a weapon. But nothing had connected him to Carla's case at the time. For 46 years, he had lived in the same community where Carla's family continued searching for answers. The proximity was disturbing. How many times had paths crossed over the decades without anyone knowing? McCurley's background revealed early trouble. An undisciplined teenager sent to a boys' home, auto theft in 1961, leading to a 2-year sentence. By 1974, he was married with a family, maintaining an outward appearance of normalcy while harboring whatever drove him to target Carla that night. When confronted with the DNA evidence in 2020, McCurley confessed. He claimed he had been drinking and stated the encounter was consensual, then said he panicked and ended her life in fear. The account was self-serving and contradicted by evidence. Rodney had been struck and Carla forcibly taken. The confession seemed designed to minimize his culpability rather than take full responsibility. The case went to trial in 2021. But then something unexpected happened. Mid-trial, McCurley changed his plea to guilty, accepting responsibility in exchange for a life sentence. The sudden shift denied Carla's family the full trial they had anticipated, the opportunity to hear all evidence presented and see a jury render judgment. But it did bring a formal conviction and acknowledgement of guilt. However, investigators had growing suspicions that Carla might not have been McCurley's only victim. The 1973 disappearance of Becky Martin bore similarities, and investigators began examining whether other unsolved cases in the area might connect to McCurley. During the proceedings, Carla's brother Jim directly addressed McCurley. "You've done this to other families." Expressing belief that Carla wasn't his only target, McCurley consistently denied any other incidents, maintaining that Carla's case was an isolated event driven by substance use and poor judgment. Whether this was truth or self-preservation remains unknown. No additional charges were ever filed, though investigations into potential connections continued. In 2023, McCurley passed away in prison, taking with him any knowledge of whether other families were still searching for answers about their own losses. His passing ended any possibility of additional prosecutions if evidence had eventually connected him to other cases. One detail that emerged during the investigation added another layer to the story. McCurley had hidden a weapon for 46 years, keeping it as some form of reminder or trophy. The deliberate preservation of this item suggested someone who hadn't simply tried to forget what happened, but had maintained a connection to it. The case led to legislative action. The Carla Walker Act, passed in 2023, provides funding specifically for DNA testing in cold cases, ensuring that other families won't have to wait as long as the Walkers did for answers. The legislation transforms one family's 46-year wait into a resource for others still searching. For Rodney McCoy, who had lived for decades knowing he was the last person to see Carla alive, the resolution brought a complicated mix of relief and renewed grief. The DNA evidence that finally identified McCurley proved what Rodney had always maintained, that someone had struck him and taken Carla that night. But it couldn't erase the decades of wondering and the questions about whether he could have done something different. Yet some individuals didn't wait decades. Their actions brought immediate consequences they couldn't escape. Deborah Lee Miller. Mansfield, Ohio, in 1981, was a community where people knew their neighbors, where an apartment building meant familiarity with those living upstairs and downstairs. Deborah Lee Miller lived in such a building on April 29, 1981, when someone entered and attacked her, using an oven grate in a prolonged assault that left her life ended. The investigation at the time interviewed neighbors and known associates, including James Van Nest, who lived in an upstairs apartment. Van Nest provided a statement about his activities that day, and investigators moved on to other potential leads. The case eventually went cold, joining thousands of others where physical evidence existed but couldn't be connected to a specific person. Deborah's diary contained entries that referenced relationships with law enforcement officers, leading to questions about potential misconduct and whether those connections had somehow contributed to what happened. A 1989 probe cleared the officers but raised questions about how thoroughly the original investigation had been conducted. The shadow of incomplete investigation would hang over the case for decades. In 2021, investigators decided to reopen the case, applying modern DNA technology to evidence preserved from the scene. The profile they developed matched James Van Nest, the upstairs neighbor who had been interviewed in 1981. When contacted by investigators in 2021, Van Nest admitted he had lied during the original interview, acknowledging that his statement hadn't been truthful about his activities and proximity to Deborah's apartment that day. The admission confirmed what the DNA suggested. Van Nest had been involved in what happened to Deborah, but the revelation of evidence didn't lead immediately to arrest. Investigators needed to build their case, gather additional evidence beyond the DNA match, and prepare for prosecution. Van Nest, aware that investigators were closing in, made a choice. He fled to West Virginia, attempting to escape what seemed like inevitable arrest. When federal agents arrived to serve a warrant on gun-related charges in November 2024, Van Nest chose to resist. The confrontation ended with Van Nest's passing, preventing any possibility of trial, testimony, or explanation for what happened in 1981. The timing was particularly frustrating for investigators and Deborah's family. They were on the verge of formal charges, of finally having the trial that had been delayed for 43 years. Detective Terry Butler stated that they had proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Van Nest was responsible, but that proof would never be tested in court. On December 30th, 2024, authorities announced they had officially solved the case, identifying Vanest as the person responsible for Deborah's demise. The announcement brought a form of closure. The family finally knew who had taken Deborah's life and could stop wondering if the person responsible was still out there, possibly doing harm to others. But it was closure without justice in the traditional sense. No arrest, no formal charges filed, no trial where evidence would be presented and tested, no opportunity for victim impact statements or for Deborah's family to confront the person responsible directly. No conviction that would officially label Vanest as having committed this act. The motive remains unknown. Investigators found no clear connection between Vanest and Deborah beyond their proximity as neighbors in the same building. Whether it was opportunistic, whether there was some interaction or conflict that led to escalation, or whether Vanest had planned what happened, these questions died with him in West Virginia. The fact that Vanest lived upstairs from Deborah adds a disturbing dimension. After April 29, 1981, he continued living in the same building, walking past her apartment daily, knowing what had occurred there while investigations proceeded around him. When did he move out? How long did he stay in that physical proximity to the scene of what he had done? His 2021 admission that he had lied in his original statement suggests he knew immediately that he was a suspect, that investigators might focus on him. The lie was meant to deflect attention, to provide an explanation for his presence or activities that wouldn't raise suspicion. For 40 years, that lie seemed to have worked, allowing him to avoid consequences. The November 2024 confrontation raises its own questions. Did Vanest resist because of the gun charges, unaware that investigators had connected him to Deborah's case? Or did he know that the net was closing in on the far more serious matter from 1981 and choose confrontation over trial? The sequence of events suggests he may not have been formally aware that authorities had DNA evidence connecting him to Deborah's case when the warrant was served. Deborah's family expressed relief at finally knowing who was responsible, but also frustration at being denied the courtroom closure they had anticipated. The DNA evidence that would have been presented at trial, the forensic testimony, the full accounting of how investigators connected Vanest to the scene. All of this became part of investigative files rather than public trial record. Sometimes answers come from connecting cases no one realized were related. The I-65 killer. For years, law enforcement across multiple states investigated what appeared to be separate incidents. In Kentucky in 1987, in Indiana in 1989, at motels along Interstate 65. Women working night shifts at front desks were attacked. The pattern was clear to investigators. Someone was targeting vulnerable individuals in these specific locations. But without DNA matches or clear physical evidence connecting the scenes, the cases remained separate investigations. Survivors in Indiana in 1990 and Minnesota in 1991 provided descriptions of their attacker, creating composite sketches that showed a man with distinctive features. The descriptions mentioned a lazy eye, a detail that should have been distinctive enough to help identify the person responsible. But the cases remained unsolved for decades, with the moniker I-65 killer representing the mystery rather than pointing to any specific individual. The person responsible had been hiding in plain sight in a small Iowa town. Harry Edward Greenwell, born December 9, 1944, in Louisville, Kentucky, lived what appeared from the outside to be an ordinary life. He worked for the railroad, retired in 2010, and was known as a kind gardener in Lansing, Iowa. He had been married twice had an adopted daughter and a son, and maintained the appearance of a normal family man. But Greenwell's history revealed a pattern that investigators should have connected earlier. In 1963, he was convicted of armed robbery and paroled in 1969. In 1982, he was convicted of burglary and escaped custody. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, the period when the I-65 incidents occurred, Greenwell's work as a railroad employee gave him mobility and access to travel corridors that included the interstate route where these cases clustered. In 1998, he faced charges for weapon possession, demonstrating a continued pattern of concerning behavior even years after the interstate incidents. Yet none of these encounters with law enforcement connected him to the unsolved cases. He remained below the radar, a man with a criminal history but not one associated with the specific pattern investigators were tracking. Greenwell passed away from cancer in 2013. His connection to the I-65 cases still unknown. For another 9 years, the pattern remained unsolved. Families still searching for answers about what happened to their loved ones at those motel desks. The breakthrough came in 2022, when genetic genealogy matched DNA from the scenes to Greenwell's profile with 99.999% certainty. The revelation came nearly a decade after his passing, making prosecution impossible, but finally giving names to the pattern that had haunted investigators for decades. The victims were Vicki Heath in Kentucky in 1987, and Margaret Gill and Jean Gilbert in Indiana in 1989. The survivors who had provided descriptions were finally validated. The man they described was real, and he had indeed been responsible for what happened to them. And to those who didn't survive, Jean Gilbert's daughter recalled her mother's final words, "I love you. I'll see you tomorrow," spoken in a phone call just before her shift at the motel where she would encounter Greenwell. Those words, meant as a casual goodbye, became the last communication the family would have with her. The identification of Greenwell opened new questions about the scope of his activities. Indiana State Police Sergeant Glenn Fifield noted that there was a real possibility of other victims, given Greenwell's extensive travel for work and his demonstrated pattern of targeting specific vulnerable situations. Investigators across the Midwest began reviewing unsolved cases from the era, looking for potential connections. The motive appears to have been a combination of opportunity and specific targeting. Greenwell selected situations where individuals were alone, working night shifts, with a limited ability to call for help quickly. The motel settings provided temporary locations where he wouldn't be known, where he could approach under the guise of a customer, and where he could leave before morning brought additional witnesses or discovery. His ability to evade identification for so long reveals both the limitations of pre-DNA investigation methods and the advantages that mobility gave to someone willing to operate across multiple jurisdictions. Each incident was investigated separately by different agencies, and without the DNA technology to connect the scenes, the pattern remained visible but unsolved. Greenwell's 2013 passing meant that many questions would remain forever unanswered. How many victims were there really? What drove him to target these specific situations? Did he stop after the early 1990s? Or did he simply change his pattern to something less recognizable? The families of victims got the name that solved decades of mystery, but not the fuller accounting that testimony at trial might have provided. The case remains officially solved, but with acknowledged uncertainty about its full scope. Investigators continue examining cold cases from the era, wondering which might connect to Greenwell and which remain separate mysteries. Each potential connection requires careful DNA analysis and evidence review. work that continues years after the initial identification. But some victims remain without names even after decades of searching. Woodlawn Jane Doe. September 12, 1976, brought a discovery in Woodlawn, Maryland that would puzzle investigators for 45 years. A body was found, carefully wrapped in a sheet, face covered with bandanas and a grass seed bag from Massachusetts. The scene suggested someone who had taken time with the disposal, who had access to specific materials that would become crucial forensic clues decades later. The victim was young, with distinctive features including wavy dark hair, brown eyes, and dark complexion. 2 tattoos marked her body, JP on one location, and a design on her right shoulder. These identifying marks should have made identification straightforward. Tattoos are distinctive, memorable, the kind of thing families notice and remember. Yet, no one came forward to identify her. Autopsy revealed she had been beaten, strangled, and harmed in other ways before being left in Woodlawn. The presence of chlorpromazine in her stomach suggested she may have been medicated, possibly indicating connection to an institution or medical facility. The drug, combined with a careful wrapping, created a profile that seemed like it should lead somewhere, but didn't. One of the most intriguing forensic details involved pollen analysis. Samples from the sheet and wrapping materials contained cedar and hemlock pollen, characteristic of the Boston and New York areas, suggesting either the victim or the materials had come from the Northeast before ending up in Maryland. The grass seed bag, specifically from Massachusetts, reinforced this geographic connection. The JP tattoo sparked theories about its meaning. Investigators speculated it might reference Jamaica Plain, a neighborhood in Boston, fitting with the pollen evidence and northern origins. But speculation didn't lead to identification, even with age progression images and repeated public appeals. Witnesses reported seeing a Ford van in the area around the time of discovery, but without additional details, that sighting led nowhere. The case became one of those frustrating situations where investigators had multiple clues: tattoos, pollen, distinctive wrapping materials, but couldn't connect them to a specific identity. For decades, she remained Woodlawn Jane Doe, buried without a name, another unidentified victim whose family presumably searched without knowing where to look or that their loved one was in Maryland at all. The breakthrough came in 2021 when Othram and Bode technology used advanced DNA analysis to build a genetic profile. The genetic genealogy led to family connections, and on September 15, 2021, she was identified as Margaret Federoff from Alexandria, Virginia. Margaret had been a student at Hayfield Secondary School when she disappeared in late summer 1975. She was reported missing by her family, but somehow that report never connected to the unidentified body found in Maryland over a year later. The failure to make this connection meant Margaret remained unidentified, even though someone was looking for her. The identification answered one crucial question: who she was, but left the most important question unanswered. Who was responsible for her being in Woodlawn in September 1976? The person who wrapped her body carefully, who transported her from wherever she encountered them, who possessed the Massachusetts seed bag and the sheet with Northeast pollen. That person has never been identified. Baltimore County Police continue investigating, seeking any information about Margaret's activities in the months before she was found. The year between her disappearance in 1975 and the discovery in 1976 represents a crucial gap. Where was she during those months? Who did she encounter? The tattoos suggest she was alive long enough after leaving Alexandria to get that work done, but when and where remain unknown. A $2,000 reward remains offered for information leading to the identification of who was responsible. For Margaret's family, the 2021 identification brought the painful closure of knowing what happened to her, but without the fuller closure of knowing who was responsible or why. The pollen evidence, so distinctive and specific, suggests someone who had recently been in the Northeast or had access to materials from there. The careful wrapping indicates someone who took time with disposal, who wasn't acting in pure panic, but with some degree of planning. The chlorpromazine raises questions about whether Margaret had been in an institutional setting, whether the medication was prescribed or administered for other purposes. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.